Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today for our webinar. We are launching our research briefing, Balancing the U.S. Agricultural Trade Deficit with Higher Value Food Crops, as we continue our campaign to advocate for food, not feed, in the 2023 Farm Bill. I'm Jessica from the Farm Action team, and I'll be moderating our webinar today. Our report launched today comes on the heels of the USDA's recent dismal agricultural trade projection that the U.S. agricultural trade deficit will increase by 45% in fiscal year 2024. 2024 will mark the fourth time the U.S. has run an agricultural trade deficit since 2019, leaving the U.S. food system increasingly reliant on other nations. This outlook doesn't come as a surprise. In recent years, the U.S. has shifted the majority of our farmland towards growing grain crops for livestock feed and fuel production instead of growing higher value, nutritious food crops. As a result, we've become increasingly dependent on imports for our supplies of produce. But the good news is we can change this. Today, we're going to hear from paper author Allison Grantham of Grow Well Consulting and Joe Maxwell of Farm Action Fund to learn how we got here, how many acres we need to shift from feed grains to higher value food crops to balance the trade deficit, and what policies we need in place to ensure success in shifting our farmland to producing food, not feed. We'll have 15 minutes for Q&A at the end of the presentations, and you can go ahead and use the Q&A feature on Zoom to submit your questions as we go. I am very pleased to introduce paper author Allison Grantham, PhD. Allison is a scientist and business executive who founded and leads Grow Well Consulting. She works with leading nonprofits, private sector businesses, and foundations to build a more just, regenerative, and resilient food future. Prior to launching Grow Well, she led food systems R&D and then food procurement at an $800 million revenue e-commerce food company. Previously, she led Penn State Extension's beginning farmer training program and directed research at the Rodale Institute. Allison currently serves on the Rodale Institute's board of directors and the National Academy of Sciences Committee to advise the U.S. Global Change Research Program, the body that oversees climate and other global change research across the 14 federal agencies. So with that, I will pass it over to you, Allison.
Thank you so much, Jessica. It is an honor and a pleasure to be here to talk about one of my favorite paradoxes of the American food system, which is why we have so much farmland and yet import so much of our food. So I will be talking today about trends over the last 5 years in food crop acreage, production, and trade, imports and exports that occurred during the last Farm Bill as we talk about the next one. Next slide, Jessica. Okay, so what are we talking about? So we have nearly 1 billion acres of farmland, but not all of that is cropland. About 400 million acres is cropland. And what are we doing with all of that? As Jessica alluded, we're using very little of it. That blue wedge down there at the bottom, along with the almost invisible wedges for vegetables, fruit, nuts, and melons, to grow food crops. So by food crops, we're talking about those things: melons, fruits, nuts, vegetables, peanuts, rice, and wheat. And most of the acreage in food crops is indeed in wheat, or about 90% of it. So it's important to just keep that scale in mind. And as you can see, about half of that 400 million acres is in those what we call feed crops, although a large segment of them are going to energy. Next slide. So how has this changed sort of on average over these last 5 years? So there have been some pretty decent sized shifts in how we are using our domestic cropland in the US. And the most notable things here are a big drop in the acreage of food grains and legumes. There has also been a drop in vegetable acreage, that is pretty substantial, that is distributed broadly across pretty much all vegetable crops, with the exception maybe of pumpkins, which were pretty flat. And a small increase in fruit and nuts. It's not really fruit, it's pretty much just nuts, and within nuts, pretty much just almonds, and to a smaller degree, pistachios. But those are a crop that we primarily import. Over the last 5 years. Between 66 and 81% of those nuts were exported. So by and large, the story here is that we are producing or allocating fewer and fewer acres to actually growing food. Next slide. So one of the key things that we all are told, half of our plates should be fruit or vegetables. So you'd think, well, maybe half of our acreage should be fruit and vegetables. Well, that's obviously from the last 2 slides, we know not true. But just how small of a wedge are we talking about? So we're talking about a small wedge that got much smaller. So as of 2022, we were down to just 2 million acres of vegetables in the US that were harvested, which is down 20% since 2018. And about 40% of that acreage is concentrated in California, as you can see in that map. Next slide. So you think, well, did our diets get terribly worse? Well, no, actually not. Our diets are terrible, but they didn't get that much worse over the last 5 years. And that is largely because of increases in imports, which offset decreases in domestic production. Next slide. So that's the vegetable story. Moving on to the fruit story. Fruit is also on a decline. Citrus is really on an epic decline. Orange production has fallen to the lowest levels, or to levels that we haven't seen since the 1930s. And it, again, is not distributed evenly nationally. A lot of it's concentrated in California, where production has been pretty challenged by drought and climate change. We're also seeing decreases, not just in citrus, but broadly distributed across apples, across berries, and melons. Next slide, please. So looking at a couple specific examples of fruit acreage, what was that change in harvested acreage of some of the top 5 consumed fruits? So you can see it's pretty widely decreasing. So apples, oranges decreased by tens of thousands of acres in the case of oranges. Grapes, also tens of thousands of acres, with some small average increases in strawberries and blueberries due to strong demand for those crops. Next slide. All right, so how are we eating if we have so much farmland and so few acres of food crops? What is happening to fill our plates? So let's look at what we are doing. Next slide. Okay, so this is the story over the last 5 years. In the yellowish color are exports on all of the upcoming slides, and imports are in blue. And what you see is an upward trending line in imports and a downward trending line in exports, which makes sense when after what we have just discussed around what we're actually doing with our croplands, that there is just less production happening to export. So this is looking at the vegetable category overall, and you see that strong sort of positive trend line in increasing imports. And then, looking specifically at some of the sort of broader acre, well, relatively to vegetables, potatoes, tomatoes, onions, lettuce, and carrots, which we saw on slide 5, are really the majority of the vegetables that Americans eat. We went from having exports exceed imports to imports exceeding exports, even for those bigger crops, like which is primarily potatoes. Next slide. So within those crops, there are some differences crop to crop in terms of what that how that trend happened or what was driving it. And some of them, it was, basically there was a big deficit at the beginning, and that maintained across the last 5 years. So carrots are an example of that, where imports exceeded exports in 2017, and they still exceed them by far in 2021. For pumpkins, we see a slightly different situation where imports grew and exports decreased. Next slide. With lettuce, we see a situation where there was a flip that happened, where we went from having exports exceeding imports in 2017 to imports exceeding exports by 2021. But with basically driven by an increase in imports, with exports just basically being flat. And that's a similar case to what we have seen with potatoes, where exports are relatively flat, but imports are increasing. Next slide. Onions are another one where exports are flat to declining and imports are up. And broccoli, again, you had a situation where imports have long exceeded exports, but imports are increasing further. Next slide. All right, so that's vegetables, but obviously not all of our calories come from vegetables, never have, never will. They're important nutritionally, but calorically, we've got to get some grains. And rice is an important grain crop, food grain crop. And the US has long sort of built its food system around grain production and been a strong net exporter of grains, and still is a net exporter. But we're seeing these same trends where exports are decreasing and imports are increasing. They're not quite as strong in rice, but they are definitely happening. And if these trends continue, the US could, if these trends continue, this hypothetical, could become a net importer of rice by 2030. Next slide. All right, so this is the big one, wheat. Wheat is wild. It is much more important to our diets than rice. Here in the United States, we eat a lot more of it. We also export a lot of it. What we have seen is a big decrease in wheat exports over the last 5 years as US production has decreased. So we have still a positive trade balance for wheat, but we do not have as much to export, in part because we are harvesting so few acres of wheat, and wheat production regions are really being challenged by climate change related changes in hydroclimate and drought. Next slide. All right, so this is, as you can see, sort of shifting the balance of our trade balance. In dark gray, you can see that the effect of high commodity prices and still strong trade in things like soybeans and corn over the last 5 years, although the WASD report that Jessica referenced at the beginning, we're seeing some challenges and headwinds even in soy exports projected for not just 2023, but also 2024, which is changing this picture. This is also incorporating not just raw food crops, but also things like juices, processed fruits and vegetables, consumer-oriented goods. So this can include things that were even produced here in raw form, exported, processed, and re-imported. And so that is impacting these numbers here. And that's where you can see this really strong growth in that orange or yellowish gold colored bar, which I'd like to dig into a little bit more in the next slide, please. So here we're looking at those food crops and consumer related derivatives of those. So in this produce category, I'm including not just fresh fruit and vegetables, but also processed fruit and vegetables and fruit and vegetable juices. And what you can see here is that bar shown in green is really driving a pretty large deficit, which if you just look at this segment, you're seeing that even over these last 5 years, we've had a deficit, a trade deficit in food crops, where the food that Americans are eating is by and large imported, and that deficit of this segment of our food system was at about $32 billion or $33 billion, let's call it 30-ish, which is similar to the size of the deficit that's being projected for 2024 overall but this is, again, a slightly different segment of trade data than the overall. This is focusing on food crops in particular, so not meat, not dairy. Next slide. Okay, so thinking about that number of around $30 billion and what it would take to balance that or generate that value of product. So we're looking at filling a $30 billion hole roughly. We took data on the prices from 2022 and sort of longer term averages as well to sort of get a coarse value per acre of revenue that can be generated, assuming typical yields and recent prices, to estimate how many acres of different categories of crops would need to be harvested to generate that roughly $30 billion. And so, as you can see, these types of food crops vary widely in their value per acre, but if we're sort of, I don't know, not apples to apples, but taking produce crops to fill the hole that's being driven by produce crops, we're talking about something in the neighborhood of 3 to 7 million acres of farmland. It obviously would take many, many more acres of wheat. Wheat is a much lower value crop per acre than produce crops. And I will say that this is harvested, and the other complicating factor with wheat is there were 10.2 million acres of wheat that were planted last year, but left unharvested. And that's not actually all of that out of the ordinary. Over the last 3 years, only about 80% of wheat acres have been harvested on average. Next slide, please. Okay, so how do these changes compare to current acreage? So these are approximately 3x increases for non-citrus fruit, vegetables, and melon and wheat, and more like 12x increases for citrus fruit and rice. Next slide. Okay, and so then if we look at that smaller number where you're offsetting, the deficits that we have in the produce category with some of the surpluses that we are still running in the wheat and rice and grains categories, assuming they don't get worse. This is just a scenario. This is a smaller number, it's around $18 billion, which is significantly lower. It's only about 2/3 of the projected deficit for next year. So you need fewer acres to fill that hole. We're talking, more on the order of 2 to 4 million acres of produce crops to fill that, to generate that amount of revenue at 2022 prices. Next slide. So that is just about 2x the acreage that we have of those crops, and more like 7x citrus fruit and rice. Next slide. All right, so how do those increases compare to domestic consumption? So right now, about half of produce consumed by Americans is imported as of 2021. But that, as we've been talking, has been increasing rapidly. So there's been a 72% increase in the imported share of American fruit and or American vegetable and melon consumption, and a 46% increase in the imported share of fruit and tree nuts since 2008. So this this increase in acreage would basically be aligned with producing an amount that is consistent with the amount of fruits and vegetables that we are currently consuming in the US. Next slide. How does this hypothetical acreage, though, compare to US ag land? And I think this is very important to consider as we're talking about increasing production of anything. There's oftentimes a scarcity mindset that pervades ag. And this is one place where it's not, this amount of acreage is not really material to the total amount of acreage in the US. So we're talking about 4 million additional acres of produce production, roughly 3 to 5, 3 to 7, depends, 2 to 7, whatever. Something in that neighborhood. You could do a lot less if it was all strawberries, but I'm not advocating for millions of acres of strawberries. But anyway, only 4. So compare that to how many acres of cropland we have, 396 million, or how many acres of farmland we have at 893 million acres. This is a very tiny slice of the land pie in the US, and could generate more than the projected 2024 deficit of 27.5 billion. So we're talking 1% of US cropland. All right, next slide. All right, but I'm just the person that's crunched numbers, and Joe's going to talk about some policy ideas for this. I just want to quickly note that these last 5 years of data that we focused on in this project, the trends that we see in them are part of a much longer trend. We looked at dozens of different crops, and the story is really quite similar, where we see acreage peaking decades ago, and current acreage, equivalent to harvested acreage many, many years ago. So this is an example of wheat. So wheat acreage peaked in 1981. I was not born yet. And has been falling pretty consistently ever since. So we've gone down from 80.6 million acres of wheat To last year, only 35 million acres of wheat were harvested, which when I looked at this time series pulled out of, mass quick stats, I was like, wow, 1888 was the last time we harvested that few acres. Next slide. Okay, so this is my final wrap up here. I had to boil it down a bit. I couldn't show you all these graphs, but these trends are really consistent. Rice peaked also in 1981 and is down 43% in terms of harvested acreage. Sweet potato acreage peaked in 1932 and is down 88%. Potato acreage also peaked in 1922 and is down 77%. It is not as easy to reconstruct records for produce crops. Fewer of them have long records in mass, but with the exception of strawberries, all of them peaked in 2000 or earlier and are down 20 to 90% from their peaks. So strawberry production peaked in 2013. And the harvested strawberry acreage in 2022 was 13% below the 2013 peak. So there is this large and growing disconnect between American agriculture and the American food supply. Fewer and fewer acres of American farmland are growing food crops, and we're increasingly importing what we do eat. And this was a consistent and growing disconnect across the entire last Farm Bill. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Allison. And I'm going to go ahead and just before I introduce Joe, I'm going to just paste a couple of links into the chat for you all. So these are our policy recommendations as well as Allison's report. Okay, great. And so next we are going to hear from Farm Action Fund and Missouri farmer Joe Maxwell. With that, you can take it away, Joe.
Thank you, Jess. And Allison, I want to thank you so much for your excellent work in diving into the numbers and bringing forward this data today. The key findings that we focused on were in the statement contained in the briefing paper that has been shared in the chat. It states, at 2022 prices, just 3.5 to 4.4 million acres of higher value fruit, vegetables, and melons would be needed to generate 32.9 billion in sales. That would balance the produce trade deficit and exceed the overall agriculture trade deficit of 27.5 billion. We felt in reviewing this data that out of the 900 million, almost 900 million acres of farmland, that this number was very realistic and would allow additions of healthy foods for our citizens, as well as economic security, national security, and food security for our country. In developing our policy recommendations to address this issue, we began by recognizing from current trends that we do not believe the United States will export its way out of the current agriculture trade deficit. I believe that the data that Allison has presented would also bear this out. That this agriculture trade imbalance has been driven by federal farm policy. That it heavily subsidized lower value feed grains has taken over the major areas of production and has led us to an agriculture trade deficit in this great powerhouse we call in the United States agriculture community. Therefore, we recommend U.S. policymakers implement a federal farm policy that restores domestic production of higher value food items such as vegetables and fruits. The domestic production of these agricultural goods will lessen our need to import them from other countries, strengthening our food security and our national security. This report demonstrates that U.S. agriculture is not feeding us here at home, and it's clearly not feeding the world, as it oftentimes wants to proclaim. In developing our policy recommendations for this paper, we also had a lens for increasing the health and welfare of the U.S. population and providing market opportunities for our farmers. Our recommendations focus on two prongs of policy change: improve crop insurance and risk management, and expand access to markets. Next slide. Improve crop insurance and risk management. Farming requires a heavy reliance on access to capital, most of which is borrowed through traditional lending institutions and government lenders. These lenders are very much risk adverse in their lending policies. Farmers are told to focus their production on crops covered by risk management tools such as federal crop insurance or subsidized through the commodities program. We're not saying farmers can't get loans for other types of production, but they will have to provide a more significant amount of collateral of their own dollars to do so. Therefore, in wanting to shift farmers back into the production of food crops and fruits and vegetables, the U.S. is going to have to realize a shift in the way in which we subsidize and provide risk management for those crops. The subsidized feed grain crops to food crops, that shift, federal risk management tools must be reformed, putting food crops, fruits, and vegetables on the same level of subsidy opportunity and access to risk management tools as are the current commodity crops. I want to mention a few bills that we believe would begin to move us in that direction. First, Senate Bill 2598, Whole Farm Revenue Protection Improvement. One of the best ways for farmers to get risk management and to diversify into food crops and vegetable fruit production would be to utilize the Whole Farm Revenue Protection Program. However, it has had issues and problems within it, and we believe that the Whole Farm Revenue Protection Improvement Act would remedy many of those issues that have prevented farmers from being able to provide risk management for the production of fruits and vegetables. Second is Senate Bill 2421 and H.R. 4804, Ensuring Fairness for Family Farmers Act. This legislation would restructure how crop insurance agents are compensated. Understand that crop insurance is a government public-private partnership in which private agencies issue the crop insurance to the farmers. Currently, the types of programs like Whole Farm Revenue Protection, other vegetable, smaller production insurance, crop insurance programs don't properly subsidize the crop insurance agent to even write the policies. So we have to fix that to ensure that those policies are available to the vegetable and fruit and other producers out there. The Assisting Family Farmers Through Insurance Reform Measure Act is legislation that was introduced in the 115th Congress, and we're hoping to see it be introduced in this Congress as well, so they can be taken up for debate in the current Farm Bill. This legislation would redirect crop insurance program funding from some of the most profitable farming operations and providing that back to other producers to help put fruit and vegetable production on the same even playing field for access to subsidies and crop insurance as are the commodity programs. Next slide. Expanding access to markets was the second prong of change that we felt needed to happen. Providing farmers with access to higher value markets will provide incentives necessary for farmers to make the shift to producing more vegetables and fruits and food crops. In developing the recommendations, we saw the shift to balance our agriculture trade deficit as an opportunity to grow additional markets and focus on food security within communities with the most to gain. We feel that farmers need to have access to a market as we begin to shift away from the commodity production of feed crops to food crops. We need to make sure we're building a market space for those farmers to sell those goods. We have lost a lot of the infrastructure that was available in the past. So we have to begin to rebuild that local and regional system of food production and delivery. Local Farms and Food Act is one of those bills that we would recommend be adopted. Senate Bill 1205, HR 2723. This legislation would expand the local agriculture marketing program and establish a turnkey grants for the ability of farmers to access markets and to work with local food hubs and the local community. Next is the Farmers Market and Food Bank Local Revitalization Act. This legislation would expand assistance for the establishment of farmers markets in areas that need them the most. It expands markets for fruit and vegetable farmers, very critical if we're going to be able to succeed and have this shift. Finally, we combine two bills that we would recommend that Congress look at. One is the Opt for Health with SNAP, Close the Fruit and Vegetable Gap Act, Senate Bill 2015, HR 4149, and GusNIP Improvement Act of 2023, Senate Bill 2577. Our recommendations strongly recommend that Congress take a look at the Gus Schumacher Nutrition Incentive Program and begin to remove the burdensome cost-sharing requirements that have restricted grantees from accessing the GusNIP dollars. GusNIP, if you don't know what GusNIP is, it is one of the, it's not known by many, but it is one of the true success stories in agriculture. It provides market opportunity for farmers to develop their production of fruits and vegetables and moves those fruits and vegetables into the community through a prescription program. It has demonstrated, recent studies have demonstrated that for a small amount of investment, the community's health has gone up and has had a reduction in many of the chronic illnesses that many communities suffer from. So we have recommended that both of those bills be considered in the upcoming Farm Bill. I appreciate everybody attending. I thank the whole Farm Action and Farm Action Fund team, and hats off to Allison for this great report.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Joe. Okay, so we have had some questions rolling in here as we've been going along. So let's just jump right in. So Allison, this first question looks like it's for you. How does what you're seeing line up with the government's dietary guidelines?
Yeah, so we do not produce enough fruits and vegetables to align with the federal dietary guidelines. And Americans eat about, their diets fall about 50 to 70% short of federal dietary recommendations for fruit, vegetable, whole grain consumption. So we need to approximately double to triple consumption of those healthy foods, which is roughly aligned with the increase that we would also hypothetically need to generate revenue equivalent to the projected overall trade deficit and the observed produce trade deficit.
Thank you, Allison. Joe, we have one for you. Why are farmers growing so much corn and soybeans in the first place?
Our assessment, I am a farmer, and our network of farmers across there indicate that clearly government's programs through the Farm Bill have incentivized farmers into a monoculture, industrial agriculture base, pushing towards the commodities that are more heavily subsidized, and that insurance, crop insurance covers. And that would be corn, soybean are the big ones, wheat, cotton, and sugar. We also see in the feed meat complex this never-ending influence that soybeans, corn, and then the meat packers have to influence that policy. So they are influencing for increase in production of corn and soybean, which are feed grains. It oftentimes has the effect of overproducing those so that the meat packers can have cheaper feed. And that influence locks in those subsidies. And what we've seen is heavy production and a reduction in support for food for us. And we're now in a national security and food security concern.
Thanks so much, Joe. So here's another question. Is the decline in citrus production due to climate change? I'm thinking of issues Florida is having at the moment.
I can take that. So climate change is an inescapable reality, and there are definitely disruptions in production that are related to climate change in California, related to the drought, the 20 years of, well, more than that, but the most recent 20 years, there just simply was not enough water. And so that was impacting production in California. With citrus in particular, citrus greening, and sort of erratic climate, which is climate change related. So climate change is not just warming, it's more extreme weather events. So later freezes in Florida, abnormally cold weather, as well as hurricanes, which are increasing in frequency. All of that is impacting it. I would say, though, the impact of those is stronger because, as I showed in that map in my presentation, our production of specialty crops is really highly concentrated. So like much of the apples are all in Washington, much of the 40% of the vegetables all in California. So we have, and it also came into play with wheat. The fact that we're only harvesting about 80% of the acres that are planted, because a lot of wheat production is happening on more marginal geographies where groundwater is running out and severe drought and extreme temperatures are occurring with increasing frequency. So, yes, short answer.
Thank you, Allison. Our next question, who do we contact to protest the U.S. effort to force Mexico to accept GMO corn crops?
I can probably take that. That's okay, yes. One, we are strongly opposed to USDA and the trade officials of the Biden administration from forcing GMO production onto our farmers, as well as then into the trade of Mexico. One, we would like to hear from you. We are pushing this effort. Two, let USDA know of your concerns. We saw this as an opportunity for a higher value crop, a non-GMO corn, as much as 50 cents a bushel more, an increase in value to America's farmers, and then meeting that market opportunity in Mexico.
Thank you, Joe. This one is for Allison. How much of the increases in fruit and vegetable imports is estimated due to effects of climate change on domestic production?
I can't answer that explicitly. I think this is a complex system, and the scope of this project was to quantify what the changes have been. But I can say that there have been increasing frequency of extreme weather events that have impacted the key production regions for fruit and vegetables in the United States. And So that has come into play with fruits and vegetables in California. It has also come into play with potatoes in Idaho. In the last 5 years, there's been extreme heat and drought there as well. So I would say that's a contributing factor. And it's also, I think, came into play with wheat. But it is not the only factor, because we can see, the very same regions where we are where there has I'm not a farmer in California, but where we're seeing abandonment of vegetable production, we see expansion of nut production for export, and almond production in California. So it's a complex system, and so climate plays in, economics plays in, policy plays in, and so I would say it is a contributing factor. Whether it's a dominant factor or not, I didn't do the analysis to tell you that here, but it does come into play. And we're more vulnerable to it because of the concentrated structure of the production landscape, I guess is, yeah.
Thanks,
Jessica,
Al.
might add to that, going to the very last point that Allison made, which I think is very important as we reviewed for policy recommendations. This continued reliance upon very small sectors of the U.S. When we're looking at growing out to balance our trade deficit in produce, and therefore also in all of agriculture trade, we're looking for policies that would help diversify opportunities for production across the country. That doesn't totally mitigate the harm of climate change, but it does help limit the extreme weather patterns and total destruction of whole crops. And we didn't talk a lot about that today, but I wanted to add that that is an issue for food security in this country, as well as national security. Thank you.
Thank you both. So we're going to do just one more question here. What role does crop insurance subsidies for commodity crops like corn, soybean, wheat, and cotton play in the growth of CAFO's confined animal feeding operations?
We see the heavy reliance of or the focus of our current subsidies and crop insurance. We're going to talk about crop insurance here. As driving, University of Nebraska did a report indicating that crop insurance has had an unintended consequence of driving concentration on farms. So that insurance program is driving that concentration. It's oftentimes causing an overproduction of those feed grains, which only subsidizes the advancement of the U.S. in meat production. If you're in Iowa, you see a lot more CAFOs because that's where corn's grown. So it's regional in its effect, but it clearly has had great impacts on the advancement of CAFO production within especially certain states. We also see the degradation of the environment around in those areas, groundwater runoff that CAFOs bring. So we want to put at least the same priority on food crops, fruits, vegetables, nuts, the others that Allison researched, and to at least raise our food and not just feed for livestock.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Joe. All right. Well, thank you all so much for joining us today. I know there were a lot of questions that we didn't have time to answer, but please send any further questions to our email account, which I have just dropped into the chat. And we'll be in touch with you all shortly to send a recording and other resources from today's webinar. Thanks, everyone.